In late December of 1987, thousands of Filipinos boarded a 305-foot ferry docked at the port of Tacloban on Leyte Island. On board, the 3 decks were so crowded that the vessel had developed a noticeable list. Nonetheless, a party-like atmosphere permeated throughout the ferry. It was, after all, almost Christmas, and travelers would soon be reunited with friends and family they hadn't seen for weeks or months. But later that night, what should have been an uneventful 22-hour voyage turned into the worst civilian maritime disaster of the 20th century. This is the story of the Doña Paz, a disaster of epic proportions that has mostly been forgotten. Though it's not so well known outside the region, the Philippines is one of the most Christian nations in Asia. More than 80% of the population identify as Roman Catholic, and in addition, Filipino culture is particularly family-oriented. Unsurprisingly, Christmas is a big deal, especially for those who spend long stretches away from their loved ones. Ferries are the primary mode of transportation for most Filipinos traveling between the country's 7,600 islands, but maritime safety standards are notoriously lax. Many of the ferries in service are old and poorly maintained. Crew training is inefficient or, in some cases, non-existent. Pay and morale are generally low, and regulatory oversight is spotty, to say the least. In addition, the Philippine Islands are crisscrossed by a number of busy shipping lanes that are frequented by vessels from other countries with similarly poor safety standards. As a result, maritime transportation in the Philippines has gained a reputation for being hazardous and unpredictable, and, to complicate matters even more, the area is prone to typhoons and hurricanes that can reach epic proportions. The vessel that would become the Doña Paz was built in Japan in 1963 and christened as the Himeyuri Maru. At 305 feet, or 93 meters, she was registered to carry just over 600 passengers. The Maru was later acquired by Philippine-based ferry operator Sulpicio Lines and renamed the Don Sulpicio. In the summer of 1979, the ship was ravaged by fire while carrying more than 1,100 passengers. Amazingly, everyone on board survived, but the gutted vessel was beached and written off as a total loss by the insurance company. Sulpicio Lines then repurchased the Don Sulpicio for pennies on the dollar, made extensive repairs, and returned it to service in 1981 under a new name, the Doña Paz.
From places near or far away, to places where you need to be. In comfort we'll take you on your way across the open sea.
Between 1981 and 1987, the refurbished Doña Paz provided affordable bi-weekly service between Manila, Catbalogan, and Tacloban. At approximately 8 p.m. on December 19, 1987, the 630-ton bulk carrier MT Vector left the port of Lamay en route to Masbate. On board were 13 crewmen and nearly 9,000 barrels of gasoline, kerosene, and diesel fuel owned by Caltex Philippines. At 6:30 the following morning, the Doña Paz departed from Tacloban. According to the manifest, there were 1,493 passengers and 59 crew members on board. Unofficially, everyone knew the actual number was far higher because the ferry was crowded even by Philippine standards, and last-minute ticket buyers and young children were regularly excluded from manifests. It's even been estimated that there were about 1,000 young children on board who weren't on the manifest. After making a scheduled stop in Catbalogan, the Doña Paz continued on toward Manila, where it was expected to arrive at approximately 4 a.m. the following morning. While en route, passenger Luzgardo Nieto and others discussed the ship's heavy list and complained about the cramped and unsanitary conditions. Around 10:30 that night, Luzgardo made his way to the main deck to relieve himself and get some fresh air. The sea was moderately choppy, but the weather was clear, allowing Luzgardo to see another large ship in the distance, heading directly for the Doña Paz. It's not clear how far away the MT Vector was, but there's little doubt that both vessels were moving slowly. The Doña Paz had a top speed of just 18 knots, or around 21 miles per hour, and the single-screw MT Vector was far slower. Whatever the case, crewmen on both ships should have spotted the other vessel in plenty of time to avoid a collision. But an hour later, after Luzgardo had gone back inside, the bow of the MT Vector slammed headlong into the Doña Paz's port side in the vicinity of the engine room. Inside, slumbering passengers were abruptly awakened by the deafening clang of thousands of tons of steel slamming together. The Doña Paz's lights went out almost immediately. Seconds later, the Vector's cargo of fuel and oil ignited, causing a series of explosions that quickly consumed both vessels in flames and thick smoke. The Doña Paz became a chaotic scene as frantic and disoriented passengers struggled to find their loved ones and escape to the outside decks through the darkness and noxious smoke. Many never made it out of the ship, but those who did were confronted with two horrible choices. They could either stay on the stricken ship and burn, or take their chances by jumping into the sea, which by then was already covered with flaming oil and gasoline. Worse yet, many passengers didn't know how to swim, and life jackets were locked away, inaccessible to passengers. With no other option, hundreds began jumping overboard. Most were engulfed in flames and drowned quickly. Those who could swim picked their way through dead bodies and patches of flaming oil, while around them, terrifying screams echoed through the night as the burning ships cast an eerie light over the horrific scene. Officers and crewmen on another ferry, the MS Don Claudio, witnessed the initial explosion from miles away. When they arrived on the scene nearly an hour later, the Doña Paz and empty Vector were still smoldering, and the sea was littered with hundreds of charred and oil-covered corpses. Miraculously, a few survivors were able to grab onto nets thrown down from the deck of the Don Claudio. But of the more than 4,500 souls who'd been on board the two vessels, only 26 survived, 24 passengers on the Doña Paz, and 2 crewmen from the Vector. None of Doña Paz's crew survived.
The air and sea search was scaled down, with few signs of debris and fewer traces of life. Hopes of finding anyone alive were officially described as slim. Poor visibility didn't help, but a boy floating on driftwood was found by fishermen.
Most of those who'd been rescued had sustained burns and other injuries, and all were in various states of shock. Doctors and nurses on board the Don Claudio treated their wounds and made them as comfortable as possible until they could be taken to hospitals on shore. The Doña Paz sank 2 hours after the collision, and the Vector followed 2 hours later. Both came to rest in approximately 1,800 feet of water at the bottom of the Tablas Strait. Amazingly, Philippine maritime authorities didn't learn about the disaster until nearly 8 hours after the collision. Official search and rescue operations were launched the following morning, but by then, there was nothing more to be done. Investigations by the Philippine Senate, House of Representatives, Coast Guard, and Board of Marine Inquiry uncovered glaring safety issues on both vessels. After careful analysis, it was determined that the Doña Paz probably had at least 4,500 passengers on board, instead of the 1,493 listed on the manifest. And although this was an obvious safety issue, it probably wasn't a contributing factor in the collision or sinking. The Coast Guard's investigation found that only one sailor's apprentice had been manning the Doña Paz's bridge on the night of the collision. Survivors like Luzgardo Nieto later reported that the captain and officers were seen drinking beer and listening to music that night. Another factor that contributed to the scale of the tragedy was Doña Paz's lack of backup power or emergency lighting that could have helped guide disoriented passengers toward the exits around the perimeter of the ferry. Some passengers did manage to make their way out, but the Doña Paz's life jackets were stowed in locked cabinets, and none of the crewmen came to the passengers' aid, and surprisingly, no distress signal was ever sent out. Some sources even claimed that the Doña Paz wasn't even equipped with a radio. Somehow the Doña Paz apparently did have the necessary Coast Guard inspections at the time of sailing, but papers submitted by the empty Vector's owners after the incident were found to be fakes. 3 days after the sinking, Sulpicio Lines announced that the Doña Paz had been insured for about $700,000, and victims' families would only receive about $500. However, the offer was only extended to families of passengers who'd been listed on the official manifest. Most families declined the offer out of protest, demanding that Sulpicio Lines should also compensate the families of those who weren't listed on the manifest. The Board of Marine Inquiry absolved Sulpicio Lines of fault in the accident, but the board issued a ruling against the Vector's owner and operator in the spring of 1988. The country's Supreme Court delivered a similar ruling the following year. As the shipper who'd contracted transportation services on the Vector, Caltex had no liability for damages under Philippine or international maritime laws. That said, attorneys for the survivors eventually filed suit against Caltex and the U.S. state of Louisiana, claiming that the Louisiana-based company bore some responsibility for the tragedy because it had contracted transportation services with the empty Vector without doing its due diligence. After nearly 2 decades of legal wrangling, the Louisiana Supreme Court awarded families of the survivors settlements ranging between $3,600 and $7,200 when inflation is taken into account. However, even as of this video, there are still dozens of families who are still fighting to see any financial compensation. In 2018, a group known as the Doña Paz Tragedy Claimants Association was formed by families of victims as a way to fight together for justice, and they come together each year to commemorate the tragedy and celebrate the lives of those lost. The Doña Paz disaster became such a global story that Pope John Paul II and Queen Elizabeth expressed their condolences to the families of the deceased. But though well-publicized disasters often lead to sweeping reforms, this doesn't seem to be the case in the Philippines. After the Doña Paz incident, a number of the Sulpicio Line's vessels were involved in additional accidents. In October of 1988, the Doña Maryland sank off Leyte province, taking approximately 300 lives. In September of 1998, nearly 200 died when the ferry the Princess of the Orient sank near Fortune Island. Then, in June of 2008, about 800 people lost their lives when the Princess of the Stars capsized and sank during a typhoon. In a bid to shake off its bad reputation, Sulpicio Lines changed its name to Philippine Span Asia Carrier Corporation in 2010. But on August 16, 2013, one of its cargo ships, the MV Sulpicio Express 7, collided with the ferryboat MV St. Thomas Aquinas near the port of Cebu. The St. Thomas Aquinas sank just 30 minutes later, taking 108 passengers down with it. 733 passengers managed to survive the ordeal, but by 2015, the country's Maritime Industry Authority had seen enough. It was finally ruled that Philippine Span Asia Carrier Corporation was officially out of the passenger business and could only transport cargo. Though the company appealed the ruling, it was upheld by the Court of Appeals in 2018. According to the Philippine Span Asia Carrier Corporation's website, it's now one of the largest domestic shipping lines in the Philippines, but the company's history is a stark reminder of what happens when greed and gross negligence combine.